There is a scene in season 7 where Negan walks through Alexandria like he owns it, because at that point in the story, he does. He opens refrigerators, he sits on couches, he holds Judith, he tells Rick, plainly and without cruelty, that everything Rick sees, everything Rick has built, everything Rick has protected and fought for and bled for across 6 seasons of television, belongs to Negan now. And Rick just stands there, hands at his sides, eyes down. The audience watching that scene was meant to feel what Rick felt: humiliation, rage, helplessness. And most of them did. But there was a smaller group of viewers, the ones who had been paying very close attention to the logic of this world, rather than just following the characters they loved through it, who felt something more complicated. Because those viewers had noticed something over the previous 6 seasons that Rick himself had never quite understood. Negan was not an anomaly in the Walking Dead world, he was the destination. The logical endpoint of a set of conditions that Rick had been wandering through for years, without recognising what they meant. The apocalypse did not create Negan. The apocalypse revealed that a Negan was always inevitable, and Rick, for all his strength and instinct and stubborn moral clarity, never fully understood why. Tonight we are going to spend some real time with that question. What did Negan understand about this world that Rick spent 11 seasons refusing to see? And what does the answer tell us about the show's deepest argument, the one it was making quietly, underneath every season of survival horror and character drama and action? Get comfortable. We are going to take our time with this one. The standard reading of Negan goes something like this. He is a monster. He arrived on screen and killed Glenn and Abraham and broke Rick Grimes and terrorised communities across several counties. And when he was finally defeated, justice was served. And then the show spent 3 more seasons trying to rehabilitate him, which irritated half the fan base and satisfied the other half, and eventually he became something like a good person, or at least a person seriously trying to be one. That is the arc, the monster who learned to be human again. That reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that genuinely matters, because it treats Negan as primarily a moral problem rather than a philosophical one. It asks the question, was Negan bad? And answers yes and then moves on. What it does not ask, what most conversations about this character do not spend enough time on, is a different question entirely. Not was Negan bad, but was Negan right? That is a much harder question. Because when you actually look at what Negan believed about the world he was living in, when you strip away the performance and the cruelty and the deliberate theatricality of everything he did, what you find underneath is a coherent and internally consistent understanding of how human civilization actually functions at its most foundational level. An understanding that the history of human societies largely supports. An understanding that the Walking Dead world validated over and over in every season that preceded his arrival and in every season that followed it. Rick Grimes had a different understanding. Rick believed that civilization was primarily a set of values, that if you held on to the right things, the humanity, the compassion, the willingness to extend trust, the commitment to protecting people who could not protect themselves, civilization would follow. That the ethics came first and the order emerged from them. That who you were as a person was more important than what systems you built, because the systems would eventually reflect the people who built them. Negan believed the opposite. He believed order came first, that the ethics were a luxury you earned after the order was established and secured, that in the absence of enforced structure, the values Rick cared about were not just ineffective, but actively dangerous because they signalled vulnerability to everyone who did not share them. And in this world, there were a great many people who did not share them. The show spent 11 seasons testing both of those positions against reality. And the results were complicated and interesting and worth examining carefully. But before we can really understand what Negan knew, we need to understand what Rick was, at the deepest level of his identity, and why that identity carried a flaw that Rick was genuinely unable to see in himself. Rick Grimes is a sheriff's deputy from a small town in Georgia who woke up from a coma into the end of the world. That origin is not incidental to who he becomes. It is the source code for everything he does across 11 seasons of television, and understanding it properly changes how you read almost every major decision he makes. A sheriff's deputy in the old world was a specific kind of person. Not just a person with a gun and a badge, but a person who represented an institution. The badge was not Rick's authority. It was the state's authority, borrowed by Rick for the duration of his service. The gun was not Rick's right to use force. It was the state's right to use force, delegated to Rick within specific legal and ethical parameters defined by laws he did not write and procedures he did not design. Rick's job in the old world was not to decide what justice looked like. His job was to enforce the justice that a complex system of laws and courts and elected officials and centuries of institutional precedent had already defined. He was an agent of something vastly larger than himself. His authority was borrowed, temporary, and contingent on the continued existence of the institution he represented. The world ended. The institution ended with it. The badge became a piece of metal with no more intrinsic authority than a bottle cap. The laws became suggestions that no one was left to enforce. The courts and the officials and the whole architecture of legitimate authority that Rick had spent his adult life serving disappeared overnight into the same silence that swallowed everything else. But Rick did not disappear with it. And here is the thing that the show never quite lets go of across 11 seasons. Rick never stopped thinking like a sheriff's deputy. Even after he was making genuinely brutal decisions that no legal system would have sanctioned. Even after he was biting men's throats out in the dark to protect his son. Even after he had built and lost and rebuilt a dozen different versions of civilization in the ruins of the world he grew up in, the fundamental framework was still operating inside him. There were good people and bad people. The good people deserved protection, the bad people deserved justice, and Rick was the person who would provide both, because someone had to, and Rick was there and Rick was capable. That framework is not wrong. It is not even naive exactly. There are genuine human goods embedded in it, goods worth fighting for and worth preserving. But it carries a structural problem that becomes visible the moment you ask a specific question. Where does Rick's authority actually come from in this world? In the old world, the answer was clear. The state, the law, the consent of the governed, institutionalized over centuries into a system that everyone in that society understood and mostly accepted and participated in maintaining. Rick's authority was borrowed from something that existed before him and would exist after him, something that did not depend on Rick personally for its legitimacy. In the Walking Dead world, that source is gone. Rick's authority comes from Rick, from his competence, his willingness to use force when necessary, his track record of keeping people alive, his personal charisma, the relationships he's built with specific individuals who've chosen to follow him because they trust him specifically. It is entirely personal and entirely contingent on Rick's continued presence and effectiveness. This is not a criticism of Rick. It is simply a description of the world he is operating in and of the enormous structural vulnerability it creates in everything he builds. Every community Rick creates is built on that personal authority. When Rick is present, the system functions. When Rick is absent, threatened, or compromised, the system wobbles. Because the system is not really a system. It is a collection of people who trust one person, and when that person is not there, the collection does not automatically know what to do with itself. Negan understood this about Rick from the moment he encountered him. He understood it so clearly, so completely, that his entire strategy for handling Rick's group was designed to exploit exactly this vulnerability. Do not destroy Rick's community. Dominate Rick personally. Because the community is just an extension of Rick's authority, and if you break Rick's authority, you acquire the community without having to fight for it piece by piece. The plan worked. The Season 7 premiere is one of the most disturbing pieces of television the show produced, and part of what makes it disturbing is how precisely Negan had diagnosed the situation. He needed Rick to kneel, not because Rick kneeling was inherently useful, but because Rick kneeling publicly in front of Rick's own people destroyed the foundation of Rick's authority at a single stroke. You cannot borrow legitimacy from an institution. You cannot appeal to laws that do not exist. All you have is the credibility of your personal authority. And the moment everyone watching sees that authority broken, it is very difficult to rebuild. Rick spent most of Seasons 7 and 8 trying to rebuild exactly that. And the fact that he eventually did says something real about his resilience and about the genuine loyalty of the people around him. But the vulnerability that Negan exploited so effectively was still there when the war ended. It was still there when Rick disappeared from the show. It is structurally baked into the model Rick had always operated on, and it is the thing that Negan's model, for all its brutality, had deliberately engineered around. Before Negan arrived on screen, the show spent several episodes building his mythology through the reactions of other characters. People who had encountered the Saviours spoke about them in a specific register, one that mixed fear with something that was not quite respect but was in the territory adjacent to it. A reluctant acknowledgement that whatever the Saviours were, they were organised. They had reach. They appeared at predictable intervals. They took a predictable amount. And in exchange, they did not destroy the communities they were taxing. That last part is crucial and easy to overlook in the emotional response to Negan's cruelty. The Saviours were not a raiding party. They were not Terminus taking everything and leaving nothing, and feeding on the people they captured. They were a system, an extractive and brutal and deeply unjust system, but a system with internal logic and consistent rules that you could, if you had to, organise your survival around. You gave Negan half of what you produced. In exchange, Negan's people cleared walker populations from the roads connecting communities, provided some level of protection against other armed groups, and did not kill you or burn what you had built. The deal was terrible. But it was a deal. It had defined terms. It had predictable consequences for violation. It had a structure that communities under its authority could plan within. Strip away the specific cruelties of how Negan ran it, and what you have is a protection economy. Labour and resources in exchange for security. The threat of violence as the enforcement mechanism for compliance. A central authority that monopolises the use of force across a defined territory and extracts resources from the population within that territory in exchange for maintaining a level of order that individual communities could not maintain independently. This is not a new invention. Negan did not invent this in the ruins of Virginia. Every feudal society in human history ran on exactly this model. The lord controlled the land and the army. The peasants worked the land and gave the lord a share of what they produced. The lord protected the peasants from rival lords, from brigands, from the general chaos of a world without centralised law enforcement. It was exploitative. It was deeply unequal. It caused immense suffering for the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, suffering that the people at the top felt no particular obligation to reduce. And it was also for several centuries across multiple continents, the most stable social arrangement that human beings had managed to construct under conditions of institutional collapse and resource scarcity. the Walking Dead world, 7 or 8 years after the collapse of every government and institution and supply chain that modern civilization depended on, is a feudal world. Resources are scarce and unevenly distributed. Violence is the dominant tool of political authority. There are no neutral arbiters, no courts with legitimate jurisdiction, no institutions that everyone accepts as having the right to adjudicate disputes. There is just power and the deals that power makes possible, and the violence that enforces those deals when they break down. Negan did not impose feudalism on this world. He recognised that feudalism was what this world had already become, and he built a system that matched its actual conditions rather than the conditions he wished it had. He was not imposing an alien structure. He was formalising and systematising the informal power dynamics that were already operating everywhere across the landscape, and doing it with enough force and consistency to create predictability where previously there had been only chaos. Rick kept trying to build something that required conditions the world no longer had. A community based on voluntary cooperation, democratic decision-making, and the subordination of individual interest to collective welfare. Those are beautiful goals. They are also among the most complex and difficult social arrangements ever attempted. They require a population that shares enough values to cooperate voluntarily, institutional memory that carries norms across generations, economic stability that removes the worst pressures of scarcity, and a history of functioning governance that people have internalized. Take away all of those preconditions and you do not get a functional democracy. You get the thing that always emerges when those preconditions are absent, which is some version of strongman rule, tribute economies, and the subordination of weak groups to strong ones. Negan built to match the world. Rick kept building for the world he was hoping to create. The gap between those two projects is where most of their conflict lived, and it is why Negan was so much better prepared for their eventual confrontation than Rick was. Look at the sequence of major threats The Walking Dead placed in Rick's path across 11 seasons, and you notice something consistent about them that the show tends not to highlight directly. Every significant antagonist Rick faced operated on some version of Negan's underlying logic. Not Negan's specific personality, not his particular methods, but the same foundational principle. Power and structure first. Ethics somewhere further down the list, if at all. Terminus presented itself as a sanctuary. The signs were everywhere on the roads leading to it. Sanctuary for all. Community for all. Those who arrive survive. Rick followed those signs because he still believed, at that point in Season 4, that you could find people worth trusting in the ruins of the world. What he found instead was a community that had discovered, through their own experience of victimization, that the only reliable food source in a world without functioning agriculture and supply chains was other people. The Terminus survivors had been brutalized and had concluded from that experience that the world's permanent condition was predation, and had chosen to be the predators rather than the prey. Their logic was dark but not irrational. It was the logic of extreme scarcity taken to its darkest conclusion. The Claimers, the group of men Rick encountered on the road in Season 4, had a different but related system. Everything you find, you claim. Everything you claim, you keep. Anyone who challenges your claim, you kill. It is property rights reduced to their most primitive form, enforced entirely through the personal willingness to inflict violence. No courts, no contracts, no arbitration, just possession and the capacity to defend it. The Claimers were operating on a pre-institutional logic that is as old as human beings, the logic of simple dominance. Negan had taken that same logic and built an institution around it. The Wolves had abandoned any pretense of a social contract at all. Pure predation, organised chaos, violence as a way of life rather than a means to an end. Their philosophy, to the extent they articulated one, seemed to be that the world had always been this violent beneath the civilized surface, and that they were simply being honest about what people actually were. The Whisperers are the most philosophically interesting of all the antagonists Rick and his group faced, and they illuminate the Negan question more clearly than any of the others. Alpha had built a society around the explicit rejection of human civilization, treating it not as something worth rebuilding, but as a mistake whose time had passed. Where Negan said build a stronger structure, Alpha said abandon structure entirely and live as the dead live, without community, without attachment, without the bonds that simultaneously make civilization possible and make it vulnerable. The Whisperers had looked at the same world Negan looked at and drawn the opposite conclusion from the same evidence. Both of them had recognised that Rick's model was fragile. They disagreed profoundly about which direction to go from that recognition. What all of these antagonists share, and what they collectively communicate about the Walking Dead world, is that Negan's basic insight is correct. In the absence of institutional authority, in the vacuum left by the collapse of every legitimate power structure that previously existed, the default condition is not peaceful cooperation. It is competition, predation, dominance, and the assertion of power by whoever has enough of it to make their assertions stick. Rick encountered this reality in one form or another in almost every season of the show, and in almost every case, his initial response was the same: survive the immediate threat, absorb whoever was worth absorbing from the defeated group, try again to build something better, watch it become vulnerable to the next threat, repeat. There is something almost tragic about this pattern when you lay it out across the full arc of the show. Rick was genuinely exceptional at surviving specific threats, his combat instincts, his ability to read situations in the moment, his stubborn refusal to accept defeat when the people he loved were in danger. All of those qualities were real and they saved lives over and over. But surviving a threat is not the same thing as understanding it. And Rick kept surviving threats without fully understanding what they were telling him about the permanent conditions of the world he was trying to rebuild. He kept treating each new predatory group as an anomaly, a deviation from some baseline of human decency that the world would eventually return to. Negan had never believed in that baseline. Negan believed the predatory groups were the baseline, and that the question was not how to eliminate them, but how to be organised enough and powerful enough that they could not threaten you. This is why Negan was not surprised by any of the threats that Rick kept stumbling into. Not because Negan was prophetic, but because Negan had already done the analysis and arrived at an accurate understanding of what the world actually produced when left to its own devices. Every new group of antagonists that shocked Rick was, to Negan, simply another confirmation of what he had already built his entire system in anticipation of. There is a concept in political philosophy that defines a modern state as an entity that successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Under that framework, a state is not defined primarily by its values or its ethics or its expressed goals. It is defined by whether it has successfully removed from every competing entity within its borders the capacity to use violence independently. That monopoly is the foundation everything else is built on. Courts only function because the state will use force to enforce their judgments. Laws only have meaning because the state will use force to punish their violation. Rights only exist because the state is willing to use force to prevent others from violating them. Remove that monopoly, and everything built on top of it starts to dissolve. Not because people suddenly become bad or immoral, but because the enforcement mechanism that made the ethical structures functional is gone. In the absence of that enforcement, the structures become voluntary, and voluntary structures are only as stable as the goodwill of the parties observing them. The Walking Dead world, in the years before Negan established his dominance across his region, was precisely a world without that monopoly. There were dozens of armed groups, each claiming the right to use violence in defence of their own interests, none of them able to project that claim reliably beyond their immediate perimeter. Alexandria had its walls and its armed guards, the hilltop had its guns, the kingdom had its fighters. The sanctuary had all of those things plus a much larger territory and a much larger force. But no single entity had established the kind of clear, unchallenged dominance across the region that would have made the smaller communities safe from each other. That patchwork of competing armed groups is inherently unstable over any significant period of time. When multiple armed entities coexist without a shared agreement on who has the right to use force and under what circumstances, conflict is not a risk to be managed. It is a near certainty to be postponed. Resources are finite and scarce in this world. Territories expand and contract as groups grow and shrink. Agreements between groups have no enforcement mechanism beyond the goodwill and self-interest of the parties involved. And goodwill, as Rick discovered across multiple seasons, is not a reliable long-term enforcement mechanism when circumstances change and interests diverge. Negan built a monopoly on violence across a significant region, and he maintained it with ruthless consistency. In the territory controlled by the Saviors, there was a single authority with the credible ability to deploy overwhelming force against any challenge to its dominance. The communities within that territory knew what the rules were. They knew what happened when the rules were violated. They knew what was expected of them and when it was expected. The predictability of the arrangement was itself a form of stability, distinct from the justice or injustice of its terms. But Negan went further than simply establishing military dominance. He built an institutional architecture around that dominance that is worth examining seriously. The sanctuary had an internal economy. Workers used a points-based currency to purchase food and goods from a commissary, which means Negan had created a functioning medium of exchange and a market, however primitive and captive. He had a hierarchy of lieutenants with defined roles, Simon, Dwight, Gavin, each overseeing different territories and different aspects of the operation. He had a system of rules about when violence was authorised. Members of his own organisation who violated those rules faced consequences, which means the rules were not purely personal preferences of Negan's. They were organisational policies with enforcement. He had, in other words, built something closer to an institution than Rick had ever managed to build. Not a good institution. Not a just institution, but an institution in the functional sense. A set of rules and roles and enforcement mechanisms that operated independently of any single person's moment-to-moment preferences. Rick built loyalty, Negan built systems, and in the long run, systems outlast loyalty, because loyalty is tied to the person who inspires it, and people die or leave or change, but systems persist and transfer. One of the things the show does that distinguishes Negan from most of the antagonists Rick faces is that it lets Negan explain himself, at length, with considerable articulateness. Negan is not a silent force or an enigmatic presence. He is, among everything else, a talker. And if you listen carefully to what he is actually saying, rather than reacting to how he is saying it, the philosophical coherence underneath the performance becomes visible in ways that are genuinely unsettling. There is a speech Negan gives to Rick early in Season 7 that does not get quoted as often as the Lucille monologue, but that is in some ways more revealing. He tells Rick that he saved him, that before the Saviors arrived, Rick's group was going to be discovered by someone, and that someone was going to do to them exactly what Negan did, or worse, and that they would not have survived it. The Saviors, he argues, gave Rick's people a future. A terrible future by the standards of the old world, but a future. And the alternative to that future was not freedom. It was death or something worse than death. This argument is self-serving. It is also not entirely wrong. The Walking Dead had spent 6 seasons showing you exactly the kinds of things that happen to communities that did not have protection adequate to the threats in their world. Terminus happened to communities that trusted the wrong people. The wolves happened to communities whose defences were inadequate. The claimers happened to individuals travelling without sufficient force to deter predation. Negan's argument that the saviours were the best available option for communities too small to defend themselves independently was not a fantasy. It was an accurate description of the available options in his particular region. There is another scene, later in Season 7, where Negan explains to Rick the basic mechanics of his system in terms that are almost pedagogical. He is not threatening Rick in this scene. He is genuinely trying to get Rick to understand the logic, the way a manager might explain a business model to a new employee. People need structure, he says. People need to know what is expected of them and what happens when they do not deliver. People need someone to be in charge, and they need that person to mean it. Because the alternative to someone being clearly in charge is everyone deciding for themselves what the rules are. And when everyone decides for themselves what the rules are, you get chaos, and chaos kills more people than Negan ever has. The argument is not right in its conclusion, but it is right in its diagnosis. The Walking Dead world is full of evidence that decentralised, rule by individual conscience approaches to governance produce exactly the chaos Negan describes. Every community that operated on pure goodwill and voluntary cooperation eventually faced a moment where goodwill ran out and someone decided to go their own way, and without a legitimate authority to adjudicate the dispute resolved into violence or fragmentation or both. Negan had watched this happen enough times, either directly or through the intelligence his organisation gathered, that he had arrived at a structural understanding before he had built his own organisation. He was not working backward from his experience of power to justify it. He had worked forward from his analysis of the world to the conclusion that his kind of power was what the world required. The cruelty was the implementation. The analysis came first. Rick never really engaged with the analysis. He engaged with the cruelty because the cruelty was immediate and personal and demanded a response. But engaging only with the cruelty meant never fully grappling with the question Negan's system was answering. If you tear down Negan's system without replacing it with something that addresses the same structural needs, you do not solve the problem. You just create a vacancy. This is what happened in the period between Season 8's conclusion and the Whisperer conflict in Season 9. Negan was gone, the saviours were disbanded, the communities were free. And almost immediately they started fracturing along exactly the lines that Negan's system, for all its injustice, had been holding together. The roads between communities became dangerous again, trading became unreliable. Old tensions between groups resurfaced without the shared threat of saviour reprisal to suppress them. The communities that had been unified by their opposition to Negan discovered that opposition to something is not the same as agreement about what you are building in its place. Rick had won the war, but the peace was built on the same fragile personal authority that had been the structural problem all along, and without Rick to hold it together, it started slowly to come apart. There is a piece of evidence for this argument embedded in The Walking Dead's own timeline that the show tends not to emphasise, partly because it complicates the emotional arc the narrative is following. The evidence is this: the communities under Negan's tributary system were, in a narrow but real sense, more consistently stable than many of the communities Rick built and maintained independently. The Hilltop had existed before Rick's group arrived. It had been paying tribute to the Saviours for some period of time before Season 5. It was not thriving. Gregory's leadership was weak and self-serving in ways that compounded the damage of the tribute extraction. But the hilltop was running. People were farming, trading, practicing medicine as best they could, raising children, maintaining infrastructure. Under genuinely difficult conditions, with a significant portion of their production extracted by an external authority, the hilltop was generating enough stability for something like ordinary life to continue inside its walls. The kingdom had been paying tribute to the saviours for roughly 2 years by the time Morgan and Carol encountered it. Ezekiel had constructed an elaborate and somewhat absurd fiction around his community's submission, performing sovereignty for his own people while quietly complying with Negan's requirements behind the scenes. It was a cope, and not a fully honest one. But the kingdom under those conditions had theatrical productions and a functioning community culture and a sense of identity that gave its members something beyond bare survival to orient their lives around. None of these communities were free. None of them were thriving in the fullest sense. The tribute was real, and it was damaging, and the fear of the saviours created a constant background anxiety that shaped every decision the communities made. But they were stable in the specific sense that they were not being destroyed, not being dismantled, not facing the kind of existential threat that Rick's communities faced with regular, exhausting frequency. Compare this to what Rick built from scratch. The prison was a genuine achievement, and it fell, comprehensively, and with enormous loss of life. Not to Negan, but to a different leader operating on a version of the same foundational logic. Woodbury under the governor was another protection state defending its territorial monopoly against what its leader perceived as a threat to that monopoly. The prison fell because Rick had built it on personal authority and community loyalty, without building the kind of military deterrent that would have made the governor calculate differently about the costs of an attack. Every settlement Rick touched faced versions of the same test. Is this community strong enough to deter predation from outside? And is the internal authority coherent enough to manage crises from within? Rick's communities often answered the first question adequately and the second question imperfectly, because the internal authority was always personal, always Rick-dependent, always slightly uncertain, in exactly the moments when it needed to be most clear. Negan had engineered his system specifically to answer both questions simultaneously and comprehensively. The external deterrence was overwhelming, and the internal authority was distributed across a hierarchy that did not collapse the moment Negan was absent from any individual location. It would be a much simpler argument, and a much less interesting one, if Negan were simply right and Rick were simply wrong. That is not what this video is arguing, and it is not what the show is arguing. Because Negan's model had a fundamental and ultimately fatal flaw, and what makes it interesting is that the flaw was not incidental to the model. It was structurally built into its core operating principle. Negan's system was built on fear, not respect, not loyalty, not the genuine consent of people who had evaluated their options and chosen his authority as the best available. Fear. Fear of what happened when you defied the tribute requirements. Fear of Lucille. Fear of being made an example of in front of your community. The entire edifice of Negan's political authority rested on every community and every individual within those communities believing that defiance was not survivable. This works, for a time. It works because the fear is well-founded, and because the consequences of defiance are consistently applied, and because the alternative to submission is genuinely terrible. Negan was not bluffing. When he said he would kill people who stepped out of line, he did it, reliably enough that everyone in his territory understood the threat was real. But fear has an inherent limitation as the primary governance mechanism for a political system. A limitation that authoritarian rulers across human history have discovered repeatedly in the most expensive possible ways. Fear works when it is omnipresent and when credible defiance seems impossible. The moment either of those conditions changes, the population that has been living under fear does not gradually and carefully reassess its submission. It erupts because all the resentment and humiliation and suppressed rage that fear has been holding in place is still there, unchanged, accumulating in the dark with nowhere to go, until the moment a credible alternative appears. And when that moment comes, the explosion is proportional to everything that was compressed. Rick's coalition became that credible alternative. The moment it became clear that Negan could be resisted without immediate annihilation, the communities under his control did not cautiously re-evaluate their position. They threw off their submission with the speed and totality of people who had been waiting for exactly this permission. The hilltop threw off Gregory. The kingdom threw off its tribute payments. Even within the sanctuary itself, Negan's lieutenants began calculating their survival odds differently and making different choices. The system that had seemed permanent and all-encompassing collapsed with remarkable speed once the fear sustaining it was credibly challenged. This is the consistent historical pattern of political systems built primarily on fear. They appear more stable than they are because the suppression of dissent makes the dissent invisible rather than absent. The dissent accumulates beneath the surface, invisible to the system maintaining the fear, until the conditions change and it becomes suddenly, overwhelmingly visible all at once. There is something else Negan built, or rather failed to build, that is just as important as the fear problem. He did not build hope. The communities under his tribute system had security of a kind, in the narrow sense that they would not be annihilated as long as they complied. But they had no positive vision of the future, no sense that compliance was building towards something better. No story about where this was all going that made the sacrifice of the present worthwhile. Negan's system was extractive in every dimension, material and psychological. It took from communities without offering anything beyond continued existence in exchange. Feudal systems, for all their injustice, often succeeded in providing something beyond mere survival to the communities within them. They had cosmological frameworks, religious meaning-making, cultural continuity, harvest festivals, the gradual accumulation of craft traditions and local identity that gave ordinary people something to live within, beyond fear and compliance. Negan had none of this. The sanctuary's internal culture seemed to be organised entirely around hierarchy, performance, and the management of Negan's personal dominance. It offered nothing that people could be genuinely proud of, nothing that gave the submission a meaning beyond the naked fact of power. And so while Negan had correctly diagnosed the structural conditions of the world and built a system that matched those conditions, he had built a system that was brittle in ways he did not fully account for, strong against external challenge, given its military capacity, fragile against internal erosion, because it was generating resentment faster than it was generating any reason to stay. Rick's model was the inverse. Structurally fragile in the ways we have discussed, too dependent on personal authority, too easy to destabilize by targeting Rick himself. But internally, it generated something Negan's system never could. It generated people who wanted to be there, people who were building something they believed in for reasons they could articulate, and that gave their daily choices meaning. That difference in the quality of the human experience inside each system is what ultimately determined which one had a future and which one did not. There is a moment in the Season 8 finale that gets misread more often than it deserves. Rick defeats Negan in the field at the tree with the stained glass. He slices Negan's throat with a shard of that glass, and then with Negan bleeding out in the grass and every survivor from every community watching, he orders Siddiq to save him. Rick is going to keep Negan alive. He is going to imprison him rather than execute him. He's going to build a future that includes Negan as a living symbol of what the world survived, rather than a corpse that closes a chapter. The common reading of that decision is that Rick finally understood mercy. That Carl's death and Carl's final letters about the world he wanted to see had reached Rick in a place that nothing else had, and Rick chose, at enormous personal and political cost, to be the person Carl believed he could be. That reading is entirely true. But it's not the only thing the scene is doing. And the other thing it is doing matters more to the argument this video has been making. What Rick understood in that moment was not simply mercy in the personal sense of choosing not to kill someone who could justifiably be killed. What Rick understood, perhaps for the first time in the show's full run, was that killing Negan would not solve the structural problem that Negan represented. Killing Negan would eliminate a person. It would not change the conditions that had made a Negan possible in the first place. The communities would still be fragmented. The resources would still be scarce. The violence would still be the dominant instruments of political authority across the region. Another leader with Negan's basic understanding of power would emerge, because the conditions that shaped Negan would still be there, unchanged. Maybe that leader would have less theatre and more cruelty, maybe more efficiency and less entertainment value, but structurally equivalent, and probably with a grudge about the previous regime that would make them harder to negotiate with. Rick sparing Negan, and making the decision publicly, and using the fact of Negan's survival as a deliberate signal about what kind of civilization he was trying to build, was Rick thinking institutionally rather than personally for possibly the first time. He was not just deciding what he wanted to do to one person. He was deciding what the act of killing Negan in that moment would communicate to every community watching, and what precedent it would set for every conflict that came after. He was thinking about the message his decision would send, about whether defeated enemies could be incorporated into a future rather than simply eliminated. He was doing political philosophy in the field under pressure, with Negan's blood on his hands. It was the right instinct, and it arrived at the wrong time, under the wrong structural conditions, from an authority that was still too personal to bear the institutional weight the decision required. Because Rick's authority was still Rick. When he made the choice to spare Negan, the people in his coalition who had the deepest personal investment in Negan's death did not experience his decision as institutional wisdom handed down by a legitimate governing authority. They experienced it as Rick choosing something for his own reasons that contradicted what their grief and their justice required. Maggie, watching the man who murdered her husband walk away alive, was not in a position to separate Rick's decision from Rick's relationship to her. And in a system built on personal authority rather than institutional legitimacy, she was right not to. The personal dimension was the only dimension available. This is the cruelest part of Rick's situation in that moment. He had arrived at exactly the kind of institutional thinking that the world needed, but he had arrived at it inside a system that had no way to honour it, because he had never built the institutional infrastructure that would have made his decision legible as something other than a personal preference. He was trying to act like a head of state inside a structure that was still, at its foundation, a group of people loyal to one man. The Walking Dead eventually does arrive at a provisional answer to the question it has been asking all along about what civilization requires and what it costs. It arrives there slowly and with less dramatic clarity than the question deserves. And by the time it gets there, the audience is smaller than it was during the seasons when the question was most urgently active. But the answer is present, embedded in the Commonwealth arc of the final seasons, and it is worth taking seriously. The Commonwealth is The Walking Dead's most complete engagement with the problem of rebuilding civilization at scale. It is large. It has a standing army. It has a functioning economy with actual currency, not barter. It has professional specialization, so people are not all doing every task but are doing the specific things they are best at, which is how complex economies generate enough surplus to sustain civilization. It has bureaucracy and hierarchy and formal political authority vested in a position rather than a person. In structural terms, it is closer to what we would recognise as a state than anything else the show had depicted. And it has Negan's flaw embedded in its architecture from the beginning. The Commonwealth's order is maintained partly through the suppression of legitimate grievance. Pamela Milton's authority is not entirely different in kind from what Negan built, only more elaborately dressed and less personally violent. It depends on people not asking the questions that would reveal how unequally the community's benefits are distributed. It depends on a class system that allocates resources and opportunity based on what you were before the apocalypse, rather than on what you can contribute to the world that came after. It depends on the people at the bottom of its hierarchy accepting their position, because the alternative visible to them from inside the system is worse than compliance. The show's final arc is about what it takes to correct that, about the costs of the correction, and the people it requires, and the things it has to break before it can rebuild them on a different foundation. Negan ends up being central to that correction, which is the show's most direct statement about what he learned from being on the wrong side of his own analysis. He had built a system that extracted without investing in the humanity of the people it governed. He had seen up close and personally over years of imprisonment and observation, an eventual genuine relationship with the people in Rick's world, what a different model looked like, and what it was capable of producing in people. And in the Commonwealth arc, he acted on that understanding in ways that cost him personally, because he had finally developed the thing that his original system had been engineered to eliminate. He had developed attachments, specific ones, to specific people. And those attachments made him capable of doing something his original self could not have done, acting against his own immediate interests for the sake of people he genuinely cared about. Which brings us back to the thing this video has been circling from the beginning. Negan never understood why Rick's people were loyal to Rick. He could observe the loyalty, he could acknowledge that it was real and that it functioned differently, more durably and more self-sacrificially than the compliance he had built in his own organisation. He could even admit, in his more honest and self-aware moments, that it was something his model could not replicate. What he could not understand, at least not for most of the series, was where it came from and what it actually was. Negan's model of human motivation was fundamentally mechanical. People act in their own self-interest. Manage the incentives correctly, and you manage the behaviour. Make compliance the rational choice, and people will comply. Make defiance prohibitively costly, and people will not defy. The human being in this model is essentially a sophisticated incentive response machine, and if you understand the incentives well enough, you can reliably predict and control the responses. This is not wrong as a partial description of human behaviour. People do respond to incentives. They do act in their own interest in predictable ways, under predictable conditions. The entire discipline of economics is built on versions of this insight, and it has produced genuine understanding of how human communities function in the aggregate. Negan was not being stupid or naive when he built a system on this model. He was applying a real and partially accurate understanding of human psychology with considerable sophistication. But the model is incomplete in a way that became Negan's most significant and ultimately most costly blind spot. Because human beings also form attachments that override self-interest, not abstractly or theoretically, but concretely and specifically, and with a reliability that cuts across cultures and historical periods and individual circumstances. They love specific people. They develop loyalties to specific communities. They make sacrifices that make no rational sense from a self-interest perspective. And they do this not because they are failing to reason correctly, but because their attachments have created obligations that coexist with, and sometimes completely override their calculations of personal advantage. Glenn Rhee went back for Daryl in the quarry in season 1, when self-interest would have told him clearly and compellingly not to. He went back into danger for people he barely knew, repeatedly, across 6 seasons of the show, right up to the last night of his life. Not because Glenn had failed to calculate his odds correctly, but because Glenn had formed specific attachments to specific people, and those attachments created obligations that he honoured even when honouring them was very dangerous. This is not irrationality. It is a different kind of rationality, one that operates on a different set of values than pure self-preservation. Negan looked at that kind of behaviour and categorised it as weakness, sentimental inefficiency, a vulnerability in the system that smart operators exploited. He had organised his entire personal life and his entire political organisation around the systematic elimination of that vulnerability. The wives were a performance of power, not genuine intimacy. The lieutenants were colleagues within a hierarchy, not people whose welfare Negan genuinely cared about, in the way that Rick cared about Daryl or Glenn or Carol. The distance was not incidental to his leadership style. It was the whole point of it. You cannot threaten what someone loves if there is nothing they love. But the strategic cost of that choice was ultimately larger than Negan ever fully calculated, because the people who loved Rick were willing to do things for Rick and for each other that Negan's people simply were not willing to do for Negan. Not because Negan's people were less capable or less brave, but because bravery in service of a person or a community you love is a categorically different resource from bravery in service of your own survival calculations. Sasha Williams took a suicide pill alone in a dark coffin and chose to spend her final living hours as a weapon to give her friends a chance. Not because she had calculated that this was her optimal survival strategy. There was no survival in it at all. She did it because she loved Rosita and Abraham and the people she had spent years fighting alongside, and she was willing to spend the only thing she had left on the chance that it would help them. Negan could not build that. You cannot manufacture that kind of commitment through incentive structures or monopolies on violence or tributary economics. It can only emerge from something real, from genuine relationships between people who have actually chosen to be in each other's lives. And Negan had spent too many years, at too great a personal cost, deliberately eliminating exactly the conditions under which that kind of commitment grows. The bitterest irony of Negan's arc is that he eventually did develop those attachments, and when he did, they made him capable of everything he had previously dismissed as weakness. The kindness he showed Judith during the blizzard in season 9 had no strategic value, and he knew it. His choices during the Commonwealth arc cost him significantly, but by then he was no longer operating purely on the logic that had built the sanctuary. He had become capable of caring about specific people in the specific, irreducible way that his system had been designed to prevent. And what that capacity gave him, what it allows people to do, is act in ways that no purely rational system can predict or contain. That is what Negan never understood about Rick. Not the tactical decisions or the leadership style or the moral framework. The love. The specific, unconditional, strategically inefficient, occasionally suicidal love that Rick had for the people around him, and that they had for him in return. That love was not a bug in Rick's operating system. It was the feature that made everything else work, including the things that Negan, with all his structural sophistication, could never replicate. Negan understood that civilization requires force. Rick understood that civilization requires care. Both of them were right. Both of them were incomplete. And The Walking Dead spent 11 seasons, across hundreds of hours of television and 12 years of American cultural life, working through the question of whether those two things could be held together and what it would cost to try. It never arrived at a clean answer, because there is not a clean answer. The history of human civilization is itself the extended argument between these two positions, and it has not yet been settled. Every functioning society that has ever existed has had to find some balance between the enforcement mechanisms that maintain order and the human attachments that make order worth maintaining. Get too far in one direction, and you have a sanctuary, stable, brutal, and ultimately doomed by the very conditions it creates. Get too far in the other direction, and you have a collection of people who love each other deeply and cannot quite manage to build something that survives them. The show is not offering you a solution. It is showing you the problem in a form stripped of the distractions that ordinary life provides, a world where the stakes are immediate and legible, and the consequences of getting it wrong are visible in real time. What makes Negan a genuinely interesting character, one of the most interesting that American horror television produced in the last 20 years, is that his understanding of the world was sophisticated enough to be partially right and personal enough to be catastrophically wrong at the same time. He built a system that matched the conditions of his world and failed to build a life that gave him any real reason to care whether the system survived him. He understood power and could not understand attachment. He understood structure and could not understand what structure was supposed to serve. Rick was the inverse of that in almost every dimension. He understood the people around him with a depth and care that made him genuinely irreplaceable to them. He could not build the institutions that would have made his communities independent of him. He understood what civilization was for and could not build the machinery that kept it running when the people who believed in it were tired or gone or dead. The Walking Dead's most honest argument is probably this: building something worth living in requires both of these men, not their methods, their understanding, the structural clarity Negan brought, and the human depth Rick carried. The question the show never quite resolves is whether those two things can live in the same person, or whether the world always has to find a way to hold them in tension, each correcting the excesses of the other, neither one sufficient on its own. Negan saw the structure underneath the story. Rick felt the people inside the structure. The world they were both trying to build, the world we are all always trying to build, needed both of those things. And the tragedy of both of them, as characters and as arguments, is that neither one, alone, was ever going to be enough. There is a great deal more to explore in the Walking Dead universe, and we will get to all of it. The theories, the lore, the questions the show raised are never fully answered. For now, that is enough for tonight. Get some rest.